Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here, and welcome at last to another full build video. It's been a busy couple of months, but I'm happy to say that today I'll be fully building and painting Eduard's beautiful F4F-3 Wildcat, a relatively new tooling for the company. It's been almost a year since I last built an Eduard kit, so without further ado, let's get right into this fantastic kit. Enjoy! Inside the box you're greeted with the usual Eduard Profi Pack deal, consisting of the grey and clear plastic parts, a nice little photo-etched fret with some extra great details, the decals of course, as well as the instructions and a small mask set. As I hinted to you before, this kit is a relatively new tooling, released originally in 2022. This shows in the plastic, with beautiful surface details, including tons of rivets and beautifully fine panel lines. There's also no flash that I could see, and the mould lines on the plastic parts are minimal. Overall, the quality seems to be very much up there. The plastic that Eduard uses is however a little bit brittle in my experience, so my only word of warning would be to take care with any thin parts, such as the interior construction of the gear bay. Other than this, I'm very happy with what I see. There's even options for different variants of the Wildcat to suit everyone's needs. The clear parts are no exception to the quality so far, with no scratches or defects that I could see. Everything is absolutely crystal clear. The decals are probably the weakest link in this kit, as they are of the new style variety with a removable cover film. They work fine, but they are pretty thick, so I'll be using some pre-cut masks to spray the roundels. Right, with all that said, let's finally begin the build. In the usual aircraft model fashion, this kit's build begins in the cockpit, with a bit of assembly before any paint is laid down. Everything here fits beautifully with minimal effort, slotting into place with a touch of extra thin cement. There were a few photo-etched parts that were added here before painting, which were fixed into place with a dab of Loctite superglue and the aid of blue tack on a cocktail stick. Following this, I moved right on to laying some paint down, starting off with a black coat that I'd be using for a bit of simple black basing later on. For this, I just used a standard black lacquer paint, as there wasn't really any need for a primer in this situation, and I've also run out of my Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. The cockpit green was then gradually introduced by spraying a mix of XF5 and Mr. Colour C135 into the centres of all the cockpit panels, developing a level of depth on the sidewalls, as well as the rest of the cockpit elements. I can't remember the exact ratio that I used here, however US interior green at this stage of the war seems to have varied by quite a bit, so I wasn't too caught up on nailing the exact colour. All detail work in the interior was carried out with a 0.15mm nozzle in order to achieve a fine level of mottling. Following this, I mixed a larger amount of XF5 into the paint mixture, along with a few drops of C66 bright green, giving the colour a bit more saturation for a thin blending coat. In hindsight, I probably should have thinned this a bit more, as Mr. Colour lacquers tend to be quite thick, but the result wasn't too bad. To finish off the interior green modulation, I loaded pure XF5 into the airbrush, thinned down quite heavily in order to add some brighter highlights here and there. When it came to painting the gear bay components, I actually had the opportunity to try a new lacquer paint that goes by the name Outlaw Paints, an originally Australian brand that has been imported into the UK. My good friend Moz over at Moz6510 Models was kind enough to send some over for me to try, so that's what I'll be doing on this build. Outlaw lacquers are designed to spray right out of the bottle, however I did go ahead and add a few drops of retarder thinner, which worked beautifully from the get-go. The results were absolutely smooth and didn't take long to dry at all. I'll be using Outlaw to spray the exterior later on, so we'll see how that goes, but my experience so far was very promising. With the major colours laid down, I could begin with a bit of detail painting here and there, using bioacrylics and a dash of water, which is my favourite combination when it comes to hand painting. There wasn't a huge amount to do in this relatively uniform cockpit, especially given the coloured photo etch that I'd be applying soon. However, something I did spend a lot of time on was the leather headrest above the pilot's seat. This would be one of the most visible details once the cockpit was all closed up, so I wanted to make sure it looked relatively interesting. To do this, I started off with Bioco leather brown base coat, followed up soon after with an initial round of scratches and highlights, using khaki as an additive to the leather brown. Finally, I added a bit of white to the mixture in order to represent the most superficial of scratches. I'd just like to take this moment before the photo etched parts to say a massive thanks to all of my channel members here on YouTube. Your support is invaluable and I can't thank you all enough. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to hit that join button down below for more info. Again, thank you all so much, and let's get on with the video. As I mentioned before, this kit does include some nice coloured photo etch, including some seatbelts that were the next things to be added. These were bent roughly into shape before being added to the seat itself, using a touch of Loctite fast-acting superglue for a strong bond. The same process was then carried out with the instrument panel components. Then, following a quick matte varnish layer to unify the photo etch parts, Abteilung 502 Sepia was thinned down quite a bit with ordinary white spirit, creating a nice wash for the interior, highlighting all the small details, as well as adding an extra bit of shading and grime build-ups. Making use of capillary action, this mixture was touched against all of the interior details, allowing it to flow through everything with minimal cleanup required. Speaking of cleanup, once the wash had dried for about 20 minutes, I began using a white spirit dampened brush to blend in any excess wash, regularly cleaning the brush off on a paper towel to dispose of any excess colour. Finally, to cap off the detailing of the interior, some minor chips and highlights were added to any outwardly protruding details using a mixture of acrylic paints and a fine brush. This is a great way of signifying high traffic areas, adding more interest to the interior overall. With that all done, the interior could be assembled, starting off with the pilot's seat, which fit into place with no problem at all. This was closely followed by the instrument panel and side panel combination, which was very cleverly engineered to lock into the correct shape once the entire assembly was put together. Oh, and we mustn't forget the rudder pedals, which also slotted perfectly into place. Next up came the assembly of the gear bay, which was a bit fiddly and I did end up breaking one of the supports. However, with a bit of fettling, I managed to make it work regardless, and to hide the breakage. Aside from this little hiccup, the assembly in this area was also pretty easy. One of the classic features of the Wildcat is of course its underside pilot view windows, which were the next elements that I added before closing up the fuselage halves, just so I didn't forget to later on. The cockpit assembly could then be inserted with no problems whatsoever, lining up correctly thanks to the design of the kit so far. This was immediately followed with the insertion of the gear bay assembly, which fit equally well despite the fiddly structure that it has. When it came to closing the fuselage halves, however, the first big issue with the kit presented itself. There was a pretty annoying stepped gap in front of the cockpit which needed quite a bit of filling, along with some other smaller gaps along the bottom of the fuselage. This wasn't the end of the world, and it didn't take too long to sort out, but it's still worth making a note of. In order to sort these gaps out, I made use of VMS Flexi 5 KCA, which works a treat for gaps of this size, and sands down nicely later on. With all of that sorted out, the only thing left before the painting stage were the wings, as well as the aircraft's other extremities and control surfaces. These all went together with no problem at all, requiring only minor sanding along the glued join lines to neaten them all up. The rudder was a little bit finicky to get into place, but with just the right amount of force it did click into place and fit perfectly after this. The front canopy part, having been masked with the kit supplied masks, could then be glued into position, serving as a partial mask for the cockpit while simultaneously being painted with the rest of the model. The closed canopy part, which I wouldn't be using, was then fixed into place behind this with Baecho liquid mask so that it could be removed later on after painting. The first colour to be laid down was of course the cockpit green shade, as this is what would be visible from the inside of the cockpit. The entire model was then unified with a layer of Mr. Surfacer 1000 mahogany, darkened with Mr. Colour black lacquer paint, and thinned all in all to about 40% to 60% levelling thinner. This mixture was sprayed pretty heavily with a 0.4mm nozzle to maximise surface smoothness and coverage. For those of you that have seen my 124 Spitfire build, I'll be using a pretty similar process here when it comes to building up the camouflage colours. This technique is sort of like black basing, in that it makes use of the dark primer underneath in order to develop depth and interest. However, it does differ by the fact that I'm using different shades of the actual camo colour instead of white to create areas of light and dark. By doing this, and by using the rivet lines as guides, I'm able to create a dynamic looking surface without losing saturation, as I'm not using pure white or pure black at any stage in the process. The first stage that you just saw consisted of patching in the centres of each of the panels with a mottled layer of pure camo colour, building up a nice base for the following layer. Next, I've added some white to the original colour, and I sprayed it essentially along the rivet and panel lines, simulating where the aircraft skin raises up on the structure underneath. This is a fantastic way of creating a stressed skin effect without actually having it moulded into the surface. I then added even more white to the bluish grey camo colour, applying this in even more reserved amounts, accentuating the gradient that I'd previously created. I also focused this on the control surfaces, as these tend to wear down faster than the rest of the paint job. As a final effect before a unifying paint coat, I then loaded my airbrush with XF18 and sprayed this on certain selected panels, breaking up the surface even further and adding another element of tonal variation. A thin coat of the original camouflage colour could then be sprayed across the entire surface, building it up gradually until it looked about right. I made sure to keep the surface looking a little bit exaggerated here, as further layers of varnish and weathering will help in toning it down further. A big mistake here would be to cover the effect up too much, as by the end of the build it would be hardly visible really. So that's the top side done. Now onto the underside, making use of a light gull grey tone. I didn't use any masking tape at this stage, as the camo demarcation lines are all hand sprayed in real life, so I did the same here with a very delicate hand. The techniques that I used on the underside were essentially the same as the top side, so I'll instead take a moment here to talk about my experience with Outlaw paints. On the whole, they are very good paints, with excellent coverage and great receptivity to other brands of lacquer paints and thinners, which is great for us modelers. They also create a fantastic smooth result and require minimal thinning when spraying. The one drawback that I came across, however, is their effectiveness at fine detail painting. As they are designed to be sprayed out of the bottle, they are of course pre-thinned, which is great for a convenience standpoint. They are also, however, designed to be fast drying, which isn't great when you're working with small needles on small details, as you'll be suffering from tip dry very frequently. The workaround for this is of course to use a retarding thinner, which is what I did. However, as they are already pre-thinned, it's very easy to over-thin them and make them impractical for use. But if you under-thin them, the tip dry problem remains. It's kind of a hard scale to balance, so that will be my only word of warning for these paints. Other than that though, they are lovely to work with, and if you do manage to find that Goldilocks thinning ratio, it'll be smooth sailing. So that caps off the segment on the main camo colours. In an ordinary build, the next stage would be the decals. However, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be using a mask set to spray the insignia on this one. Once they were lined up, this was a very easy process. The masks are made by a company called Dead Design Models, and they're fantastic for a few reasons. For one, they're translucent so you can see where they're being placed much easier, but on top of that, they also make use of a thicker layer of adhesive than normal masking tape, which allows the masks to sit into the surface a little bit, completely eliminating the chance of leakage even on complicated surfaces. This was definitely a bonus with the raised rivets on this aircraft. The shades used for the blue and red elements on this aircraft were mixed by eye, using multiple reference pictures on Google as well as the kit supplied decals. Getting the exact shade here wasn't completely vital, as colours weren't 100% the same across the board, and saltwater is notorious for changing the appearance of colours. However, I did make sure to mix them as accurately as possible. The only decals required after I sprayed the insignia were these unit and kill markings next to the cockpit, which was simply applied over the paint job, as a gloss coat was unnecessary for so few decals. I'd also be removing the decal film with white spirit later on, so there was no opportunity for silvering to occur. At this point, I did choose to unify the model's surface with a nice layer of Tamiya lacquer matte varnish, as the different paints I had used had different levels of shine, so this was a good way of unifying that effect ready for the weathering stage. Speaking of weathering, the first effect that I decided to apply to this build was a series of fine brush chipping layers, building up an element of wear and tear in the highest traffic areas such as across the wing roots, service panels on the wings, and around moving parts. The chipping on this model was applied very gradually, taking time to place each scratch so that the overall effect looked good and importantly believable. This first light blue colour represents more superficial scratches that may have damaged only the surface of the paintwork. However, I also use a yellow chromate colour after this to represent areas where the paint has worn down to the primer. Off camera, I also sparingly applied a dull grey shade where the paint had been chipped down to the metal, which was then oxidised. With all of this done, I moved on to a pretty standard oil-based panel line wash, made from a combination of sepia and black shades from Abteilung 502, along with white spirit. This was applied in the same fashion as the wash inside the cockpit, however in this case I also brushed it along all of the rivet lines, so that those rivets would be a bit more pronounced on the final model. This did of course mean, however, that there was quite a bit of cleanup necessary once the wash had dried for about half an hour or so. This was easy to sort, however, with the help of a little bit of white spirit dampened brush to remove and blend in excess around all of these surface details. I'd also let the oil paints sit on a piece of cardboard for about 3 hours before using them, which helps to get rid of excess oil in the paint, which in turn helps ease the blending process. The next weathering effect that I decided to implement on the model was the build-up of grime near the wing roots, and the areas on the wings where, in general, people would be walking and servicing the aircraft. Looking at reference pictures, these aircraft could get properly dirty, so I really wanted to nod towards this in my representation of the kit. This effect was created by first applying unthinned oil paint to the high traffic areas, applying less and less the further out into the wing I went. You don't need to apply a lot at this point, However, it's easy to remove if you do put too much on. The next stage is to once again bring out the white spirit dampened brush and essentially saturate the oil paint with white spirit. It's then much easier to work with, and you can almost arrange and blend it however you want. Following this, a soft blender brush is a great way of softening the effect, making it look like actual wear and tear on the aircraft surface instead of oil paint brushed on top. Now, the only weathering left to do is to add all of the smoke and exhaust stains on the surface. For this purpose, I used a mixture of grey and brown lacquer paints, and I airbrushed them onto the surface in a natural way. I much prefer using an airbrush for any stains that are caused by fumes, smoke or exhausts, as I think that the soft effect that it gives is the most realistic representation you can get, even better than oil paints if done right. With all the weathering done, I considered leaving the surface like that without any final varnish layers. However, I decided to go for it in the end, as it's the best way of stabilising the oil paint that I used all over the model. It was now just a case of adding all of the aircraft's features that were left off before, including the machine guns, engine, landing gear and lights, as well as removing and cleaning up the residue from the canopy cover over the cockpit. It was great to see the cockpit once again after all this time. When it came to painting the engine, it was initially sprayed with an outlaw black paint. However, this turned out to be more of a dark grey, as it was from their US military series of paints. In hindsight, I definitely should have used a gloss black here instead. It was then sprayed with Mr. Super Metallic Superfine Silver, which went down pretty well despite the lack of gloss undercoat. Any black elements on the engine were then picked out with a brush, before fitting what I presume is the gearbox onto the front of the assembly. Although correct me if I'm wrong here. It was then given a brown wash before being fitted to the model. The landing gear assembly was a little bit fiddly and seemed a bit weak at first. However, once I had it all together, it was sturdy and it looked very acceptable, with nice amounts of detail on the wheels as well. The prop was then fixed into place with super glue, followed by the rear canopy, leaving the canopy demasking as the only step before completion. I also applied a small amount of rigging off camera. However, if you'd like to know more about this, I have a dedicated video on the subject. So that pretty much wraps up my build on the new Eduard F4F-3 Wildcat in 1/48th scale. Overall, it was a very fun kit to build, with very few areas of flawed design and fit issues. It was also a lot of fun trying to work as much depth into that otherwise pretty boring camo scheme, making use of a series of techniques that I'm hopefully getting a bit better at as time goes on. Having the opportunity to try out those outlaw paints was also fantastic, and my thanks goes out once again to Moz6510 Models for sending these over to test out. All in all, I'm very happy with how the build went, with my only real reservation being the colour of the smoke that I sprayed on, amongst a couple of other small gripes. I just keep looking at it and wishing it was darker. I'd love to know what you thought of the build, however, so feel free to leave any comments down below and I'll be sure to take a look. I'd like to now thank you all so much for watching, as well as send another massive thanks out to my amazing Modelling Weekly channel members for your insanely kind support. I really hope you all enjoyed that video, and if you did, be sure to stay tuned as there's way more on the way. Thank you all so much yet again, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care and keep on modelling. Bye.